Yeah, so I think there's probably, well, I probably have 1,000 slides on the topic of um, just generally project delivery. And the reason I have about 1,000 slides is I am privileged to be able to teach much of this content through two institutions. One is Housing University, and the other one is the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada, which I am engaged as a curriculum developer, and also an evaluator for various continuing education elements through them. So I work with up and coming future architects in their basically from their undergraduate degree through their master's degree. And then I work with folks that are in another program that are going through maybe like a 10-year distance learning and studio learning process that parallels a university program. So I just have a lot of content, and I've distilled it down to kind of three kind of pieces before I get, or four kind of pieces, and I'll get into that in a second. Just to add lots of mansplaining pictures to the slides here, I thought I would just first of all, just I'm going to just reflect on, because I'm going to talk a little bit about project teams and maybe share with you the perspective from an architect's point of view on some project work. I thought I'd just highlight some of the kind of credential letters that you see there beside my name, and that's just to give you some perspective. One is the NSAA, which you see there. That's the Nova Scotia Association of Architects. They are the regulatory body. They're like, well, I think it's Doctors Nova Scotia. I don't know who regulates doctors, but it's we are regulated provincially under kind of a federal standard. But every provincial body regulates architects in that province, and you can see there I'm also credentialed in New Brunswick, Newfoundland, and PEI. And then the MRAIC is the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada, which you can be a member so long as you're an architect. So that's just, as long as I pay, I can be a member of that organization. And that's the federal body. But that federal body, the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada, which you can find easily online, also has issues or publishes a standard handbook of practice called the Canadian Handbook of Practice for Architects, which is publicly available and describes all of the kind of standards of practice for architects, which is interesting. I don't have a slide. I deleted that slide from my set. And then the other one you'll see there is PMP, and that's a certification through the Project Management Institute, which you can, as long as you have certain credentials through education, but also through experience, you can apply and then write exams for to become a certified project manager, and you learn something called the Project Management Body of Knowledge. And project management through the PMI Institute is basically developed, I would say, out of, let's say, the easiest story I can tell is like through folks who maybe been working on an assembly line for automobiles, but wanted to advance their career, but really couldn't. I'm putting a rear view mirror on cars every single day, but to advance in your career to someone who can maybe assemble an assembly line or oversee an assembly line, that takes on project management. So project management was really, as a certification, was developed for people who have expertise in their field, but want to be able to manage people who have expertise in their field. So I always look, whenever I'm talking about project management, I always look for project managers who have experience hands-on working in the industry, not just coming in as a project manager, having done something in some other industry. And that's simply so that when people try to tell you they can or can't do something, you know what can be done and what can't. So I just highlight those just to, I'm just here to kind of highlight or share information, maybe demystify some things about what architects and engineers are. So I picked some slides, and they're from maybe 4 components from some of my courses, just quickly about the difference between engineers and architects. Um, second one is really the key value that an architect brings. A lot of people don't quite understand what it is that architects do. The people on a project, so the teams on a project, and then some project construction delivery methods. So hopefully it won't be too dry. I'll go quickly through some of this stuff, but there's a big difference between engineers and architects, and some you will distill it down to like engineers are really good at math and they're kind of like science and categorization and that kind of thing. And you'll hear people say, well, at a party, I will either hear people say, I wanted to be an architect, but I couldn't do math, or I wanted to be an architect, but I am not good enough at math, or I'm too good at math, but not good at art. So the often there, and I only put these two things up, this left brain, right brain thing, to say that there are very many stereotypes, none of which are correct, about really what it is that architects and engineers do. But I will talk a little bit about the kind of disciplines and where they're derived from. And I would just say, through engineering, you become very specialized at something. So you may have a lot of creative input on that sort of thing, but you are very good basically at one kind of discipline or one kind of thing. And engineers are involved in both human habitat, insofar as like built structures, human habitat, as well as unoccupied structures. And community is rarely the primary concern. It's usually about designing something for a solution. An architect generally has a much more diverse spectrum of knowledge. They don't know too much about any one thing, let's say. And there's a lot of coordination involved of all kinds of disciplines in what an architect does. And usually through the training, through the education of an architect, there's a big education on community impact. And so kind of distilling through this, I just kind of bring it down to, an engineer kind of knows everything about something, and an architect knows something about everything. And so rarely, if you really probe what an architect knows down to the detail, you'll find that it kind of rolls up to kind of general, and I've got to go ask somebody about that. And so the comparison I might use is someone who plays in an orchestra, very good at, like this case, the timpani or whatever that instrument is, versus the conductor who is organizing the whole industry. Did I get that instrument right? See, that's the thing about an architect. They can just kind of like pull it out of thin air what it might be. I don't know if that's a timpani or not. Anyone else can just... Is this being recorded?
That is a timpani.
Okay, woo.
That's a timpani, sir.
All right, and 9 times out of 10 we can pull it off. So I also want to highlight this.
An engineer could never do that. You're right.
They might know what kind of timpani that is, though. So I just want to highlight a little bit about sort of what I see as the value that an architect brings to a project. And these definitions come from those kind of standard, industry standard or national standard kind of documents that I mentioned before. Creates, defines, and interprets plans for the construction works involving the built environment. Without this definition and interpretation of the work, the constructor does not know how or what to build. Poor decisions are made, or decisions are not made in enough time to avoid extremely high costs. So really what that's really saying is paper is cheap, actual construction is expensive, and you can draw, but in the process of drawing, you're really distilling all the possibilities of what it's not, showing what it is, and that documentation makes it possible for someone to come in and build without thousands of questions, without doing something, say, hey, that's not what I meant. And I think Lindsay, was it Lindsay who commented on, there were some things I might have done differently. Design is the opportunity to work through that. And then, so it's really just the architect writes the documents whose purpose it is to support the contract between the constructor and the client. And I'm going to get into that a little bit more in the kind of relationships. So these are just kind of the highlights. Creates, defines, and interprets to avoid high costs, and writes the document to support the contracts. And then some of the aspects of creating that value managing teams, managing people, consolidating, meshing, synchronizing, getting all the information together, synthesizing that into a solution, translating, and then putting that all into a document. And so that's, what we think of when we think about an architect and blueprints. That's probably what that means. But, we create drawings of the building the way it's intended to be, not necessarily how it should be done. And we create specifications that say how it should be done. And those look like a big phone book worth of stuff, although everything's now done in PDF and we don't tend to print stuff out too much. So the other way I tend to look at architecture just as an architect and how I might describe this to future architects as architecture students is really juggling. And what you're doing, you're juggling this vision. And we are all, I think, even in this workshop format that we've had in the Navigator project, we all have this idea of this goal or that we might want to achieve. And a lot of the work that Hadrian's been doing and Marcel have been doing is like distilling what that vision is. What is the right thing for us? And then when that gets handed over to design as a building, it's about taking that vision and then driving it into these kind of assets of drawings, specifications, schedules, reviews, creativity, innovation, intellectual property, coordination, construction, and then ultimately a building. And the main vehicle through which all that is driven is people. And so the important quality, and I have to say, we were reflecting today, we happen to have 2 long-term care projects going on at exactly the same time in our office with 2 teams, but the 2 teams running those 2 projects in different communities are intermingled. So the teams work on each of the 2 projects. And the interesting thing is that those 2 facilities are incredibly different. Like their internal DNA and how they make decisions is incredibly different. And so what that does is, even though there's a standard for how to design a long-term care facility, how the people interact with that is really important. So what is really fascinating to me is that in the process of design and creating like blueprints and building a thing is all the impacts that decision making that is driven by people has. And as clients, I can't emphasize enough how important the role you play in shaping the outcomes is. Really what happens is the architects and the builders, the engineers, they're taking their clues from you and they're trying to guide you to help you make decisions, but you are really in the driver's seat in the process. And if you're not, then I think there's probably a bigger flaw at play, but that's really something really worth considering. I'm just going to break down for you now 4 key categories of teams on a project from a kind of design lens. This is the project that is now underway, let's say, is going to be designed and built. So within the architect team itself, you might have senior architects, project managers, intern architects, student architects, architectural designers, technologists, specification specialists, construction administrators, project coordinators, and administrative staff. So that kind of makes up the complement of within the 4 walls of an architecture office. Then you have a design team, which includes the architects, but also includes this kind of list of engineers and other consultants. So the architect is usually called the prime consultant, and they will coordinate the second team here. So the second team would all fall under the architect. So everywhere from, there may be, these may be contracted to them, or they may be coordinated by, and the contract might be between these entities and the owners. But you can just kind of see the range of different disciplines and these are all people that have special expertise, like a kitchen designer. It has an incredible amount of expertise about food service delivery and how to prep food and how to store food and how to economize on labor in the making of food, for example. Another one is the overall project team. So each of these contain the last list. So this would be client, project managers, constructors, government agencies, planners, authorities having jurisdiction, and interested stakeholders. And this is just a shot of a project team from the Grace Maternity Hospital, which is now the IWK Women's Building. And this is probably 1982, I would say, with a capital cost of 43.5 million. And you can kind of see this team. My dad's in that picture, actually, and several people from our office. But this is a really big set of influencers, but then over and above that, within the project itself, there tends to be another component, which I call the influencers. And this is really made up of all the people that kind of bear some kind of input on the project. And this is just a shot of me. The middle guy is a premier, Premier Marty McDonald, and the guy on the right is Chris D'Entremont, who's now Deputy Speaker of the House for the federal government, formerly the health minister. And I'm just describing to them where their long-term care facility is going to be in Inverness in this picture. So friends of the project, business relations experts, people going through the same kind of project, other organizations. And you can almost think about your development, your navigator team as like, there's this kind of like collection now of these people that actually can have influence. And you've had sessions with other external people that have influence on projects. So I always try to keep these in mind because they actually have massive impact on a project, and can often take a project from not a project to being a project in a heartbeat. It's just incredible to watch how these external role players come to bear on a project. And interestingly enough, some of them will even show up at a ribbon cutting, having not participated a single moment in the entire project, but will be there for the shot to cut the ribbon and open the facility. So all very important considerations. I'm going to go through a little bit about the breakdown of the design phases in a project. And the kind of bold-faced and colorful text is really the formalized standard process of designing a project. So anyone who would be hired as an architectural or design team for a building would follow schematic design, design development, contractor working documents. That's 3 phases of the design process, and then into tendering and award for construction, then construction administration and warranty. I'm not asking you to remember these. I'm not asking you to really take much away from this, except to know in the industry, there's standard stuff. It's standard. And the percentages vary a little bit from contract to contract and building to building, but there are 3 design phases, a tendering phase and a construction phase, followed by a warranty phase. And the colored band on the right that goes SD, DD, CD, T, CA, and W, those are just the kind of graphic linear articulation of those phases. When you overlay workload or the amount of people involved or the amount of documents being prepared, it looks a little bit like this. So in the early days in schematic design, that's schematic. It's just the ideas, the big picture stuff. And we're ultimately going to draw some stuff in this. And you have kind of high level people involved in that project, like the kind of senior people in the organization that have done enough projects that they know how to initiate a project. And then that gets developed in the design development phase and more people get involved. So now we might be on a project, let's say on a $20 million project, might be up to 30 or 40 people. And then in the construction document phase, it involves preparing the documents that will be the construction contract, and we can get up to hundreds of people involved in that. During the tendering phase, the drawings are being bid on, and there's a little bit of a lull. And then through the construction administration phase, the architects and engineers are involved in the project with the ebbs and flows and the pace of the project. And so one thing to really consider here is just like the cycle here, the up and the down, the up and the down. And projects cycle like this. They get intense and then they stop. And then they get intense and then they stop. And if there's federal funding or provincial funding or even municipal funding or a grant, the valleys there tend to be around milestones around funding approvals, like to get money released, and money really drives the cycle as well. So the banks understand these cycles, and so it's really important to understand that there's intensity and then there's lull, and intensity and lull. And I'll bet you can even reflect even in the Navigator project how there's been these intensities and these lulls and these intensities and lulls, and you have to kind of get used to that. But from someone like me who runs an architectural practice point of view, I have to say that is one of the central themes to how I run a practice. Like, how do I keep people, how do I make payroll when I'm in a lull? Like I've got to fill that lull with another project that's at a peak. That means I've got to move my people around all the time. I've always got to keep them engaged, and I've got to keep them kind of flexible and fluid. And so the management of people and the intersection of the flow of the work is really, really critical. And you want to be aware of this as a client that, or someone building a project, that people are central and the flow of people are central to how this all comes together. This diagram, again, this isn't for testing or anything like this, but it can be read from top to bottom, from general to specific. The specific would be a building, general would be an idea or a vision. And so as we work through onto the heading design team, you can see there, going from concept to schematic design, design development, contract documents, tender and award. And then the kind of diagonal line, that's about the buildup of information. It goes from limited to massive. And there's a little bit of description there for the construction team as that project goes along. That really is a diagram that I could get into and really unpack for you. It really doesn't really impact you too much. But where I want to focus on is the two arrows on the left. So the one is the ideal arrow, and that's this idea that a project goes from start to finish in a very linear fashion. And the reality is that projects are iterative. So a project starts and then it evaluates some big ideas, and then it reassesses and then takes some steps back. So it's kind of like a 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 3 steps forward, 1 step back, 3 steps forward, 4 steps back. And the idea with any of these processes, and again, coming back to that value of drawing is cheap and building is expensive, okay, is that you want to do those big loops of iteration, of going back and rethinking early on. And that's why this system is set up, and that's why these standardized steps are here, and that is to enable that iteration to get the big stuff sorted out, and you work through step by step, so that in the end, when you're actually building the thing, you're not making big reversals of decisions. You're not thinking, oh geez, we should add another floor. That the time to do that is back at the big loops. How many floors should we have, right? So the idea here is to iterate big early on and iterate small in the end. And the key to that, the takeaway here, is that to remember there is a process. There's an industry standard process, and you follow that process. And these processes are backed by contracts, which I am about to get into. So now I'm going to shift gears a little bit about project delivery, and this is about the types of construction contracts that are held between clients and builders. Okay, so there are, and again, you don't need to remember any of this stuff. All I want you to take away is there are some things that I might someday want to know if I'm actually going to execute a project. So these are some different methodologies for delivering a construction project. The first one is known as design, bid, build, and it's just like those are the 3 steps. You design it, you get people to bid on it, and then they build it. And that's really known as the traditional method. There's another one called design build, and that is where the builder actually hires the architect themselves and the engineers themselves, and they design it together and build it all as one contract. Construction management, which is maybe more popular in the last 2 decades, which is where the traditional builder manages all the sub-trade contracts, but you have access to those contracts as an owner. And it has its advantages and its disadvantages. Public-private partnership, which right now we have a hospital or a health center being built in Bears Lake under public-private partnership. And if anyone's following the news, they know that there's a controversial component to that major project, which is at the Halifax Infirmary. A redevelopment project, which is P3, and that just means that in addition to the builder, there's also a financier, and that financier is going to fund the construction and ownership of the building for the next 30 years, kind of like a car loan, kind of like financing a car, and then the owner will lease that building back for the next 30 years on a per diem basis. So why governments love that is they don't have any capital outlay. They don't have to pay for the building up front, just like a car. If you do financing on a car, you're going to pay for that over the 5 years, except that here we're paying for a building over 30. And then integrated project delivery, which is not very popular, but is kind of held out as this bastion of hope for everyone. And this is really about signing a contract between the builder, the owner, and the design team that says, we're going to share the risk of this project, we're going to share the reward of this project, and we promise not to sue each other. And that's really about every decision is made together as a team, and the adversarial qualities that are inherent in projects are supposedly eliminated. Governments are very reluctant, and many major clients are very reluctant to take on this kind of shared risk and shared reward, because they naturally want to shed risk onto the people that they hire to help them out to do things. Just a little frame of reference here. I mentioned standardized. These things are standardized, and these are standard construction contracts prepared by the CCDC, which I think is the Construction Contract Documents Committee or something like that. National Committee, Canadian Construction Documents Committee. A national committee made up of owners, lawyers, designers, builders, and they work and update these contracts on a regular basis for each of these different delivery methodologies. And you really want to sign, anytime you're involved in a contract, a standardized contract. And the reason this is it is backed by, each one of these contracts are backed by legal precedent. So baked into these contracts, if there was a lawsuit in 1988 between a contractor and an owner, that lawsuit, the learnings from that lawsuit have been rebaked into these contracts. So there's tons of legal precedent. So when you get into a dispute on a project, or something goes wrong on a project, you can rely on some legal precedent to solve that dispute more quickly than an unstandardized contract or a non-standardized contract. I'm just going to go through some diagrams of some of this basic construction contract delivery. First, I want to get through a little terminology. What is a general contractor, which is the person or entity engaged by contract to engage and manage a handful of subcontracts with other contractors. These are known as tradespeople or sub-trades. To construct portions of the project on time and on budget, and a level of quality and finish specified in the design documents. So a general contractor is that one entity or individual overseeing a whole bunch of others. So a drywaller would be a sub-trade, an electrician would be a sub-trade. A general contractor is going to oversee all of those. And an owner typically signs a contract with the general contractor, then the general contractor signs a contract with the sub-trades. And I'm going to get into some diagrams on that. And I think I just said what a subcontractor is pretty much, so I'm not going to belabor that. So just quickly going, well, yes, no. So here are three diagrams of the top three of those project delivery methods I mentioned, not integrated project delivery and not P3, but design, bid, build, and construction management. And I'm going to break these out a little bit. So this is just the intro slide to say, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about each of these three things in the upcoming slides. So first, design, bid, build, backed by a document called CCDC2, which is called a stipulated price contract for design, bid, build. The design part, the architect designs and makes drawings and specification. The bid part, the general contractors receive the finished documents from the architects and submit competitive bids, usually saying that they'll do the work shown in the documents within the schedule specified for X amount of dollars. Much of the work is subcontracted to specialists and our sub-trades, and the general contractor oversees everything. Usually the lowest price wins the job, and that is so critical. Really what we're making is a set of documents in the design phase, and we're saying, so long as these documents are followed, we could have any builder, so let's get the lowest price. And underlying this is the concept that construction is a commodity, essentially. That means that just like an ear of corn, every ear of corn is the same. So we're going to buy the cheapest ear of corn that we can, obviously, since any ear of corn is the same as every other ear of corn. This is a major flaw in the process, because one builder is completely different from the other builder, and how they care for their clients, how they care for their community, whether they're from the community, what values they have. But they are actually forced into this as well through this traditional design, bid, build format, and that is that their work has been commodified just by the way the owner procures the work. So then the build part, the general contractor and all the subcontractors who are under the contract to the GC construct the building, hopefully following the documents. So it looks a little like this. You have your owner, and that owner hires an architect and some engineers that fall under the architect. The architect is the prime consultant to design the building. And then the owner contracts through the design bid build after the bids go out and the lowest tender, the lowest bidder wins, a general contractor who then engages a bunch of subcontractors to build the work. And I think I've deleted many of my humorous slides coming from this, but let me just see. Sometimes there's a project manager that the owner will also engage in this. And then I think this is where I say, does anyone see a flaw in what this diagram shows? Anyone, does this raise anything for anybody when we look at these lines of contracts? There's no contract between the design team and the builder team. The owner holds the contracts. And really what happens if you go back to the CCDC, which is the contract, the standard contract, this contract to CCDC 2, it says what the role of the architects and engineers is, and that is to be the fair interpreter of the contract between the owner and the constructor. Again, I don't want to necessarily get into the complexities of this because I could get into my other 1,000 slides, but the important thing is that there are contractor relationships. These are industry standard relationships, and there's a massive gap here, which is there's no contract. There's no one, the design team and the builder team are not beholden to one another. They're beholden to the owner, and inherent in that is quite a lot of conflict. It almost sets up immediately a blame game, if you can imagine. Like if this was the parent and the two siblings, right? Just, there's no accountability between the two, except by what their contract to the owner says that they are accountable to one another for, which is to play certain kinds of roles. So you want to understand this dynamic. I would have no limit on the amount of time I'm happy to share what that dynamic actually looks like on a case-by-case basis. So you can always know, you can call me and I'll be happy to demystify anything about this. But it is really an important part of our industry. And I guess the key here is it often falls to the owner in this exposure in these kind of legal frameworks. And if everyone plays the role, this goes well, but in disputes, there is a kind of procedural way to resolve disputes and disagreements. So I guess it's important to understand that these things are in play. And when we're looking at how a building gets built, that these contracts are really driving it. So some pros of the design bid build method: one maximum price with the risk of a non-budget delivery falling mostly on the shoulders of the general contractor. So they've bid on it and they've said, I'll make your sandwich for $4 and I'll have it to you by tomorrow. And that's on them. You say, okay, I'll pay you the $4. You make my sandwich according to my specifications that my designer said. The cons are it's not very flexible as some of the other models that I'll get into in a second. And there's less control over who you work with. So the lowest price wins. So whoever's the lowest bidder on that sandwich, that's who's, and if you don't like Subway, you'd prefer McDonald's, that's too bad. You can't change. There's enough legal precedent there that you're going to get the low bidder. So a quick diagram about design build. So this is supported by CCDC document number 14. The owner engages one team, usually led by a construction entity, who agrees to deliver the project and a specific building at a specific price at a specific date. It works well with buildings that are very typical, like warehouses or aircraft hangars. Can anyone think of a typical building, any that we relate to? I'll throw one out there, a Tim Hortons. Okay, so you've been to one Tim Hortons, you kind of been to them all. They're all a little bit different, but they all have the same elements in them. So design build might work really well for something like that. A very typical, it's not different from one building to the next. I can go into one and see what it looks like. So the contract looks a little like this. So you can see already why an owner might actually be quite attracted to this, because they're just like, okay, y'all build it. I don't care. You just design it. Doesn't matter. What owners tend to realize after a little while is like they have no actual authority over the designers. So when they say, well, I really want a better brand of carpet, unless they're willing to pay the builder for that, there's no real experimenting or iterating, let's say. And the builder really has no time for iterating. They're not geared towards designing. They're geared towards building. They want to execute. They want results. They don't want to think things through, right? And that's their business. I'm not saying they're unthoughtful. In fact, they're very creative and innovative. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying what they're motivated to do is execute a project, whereas designers are motivated to get the best synthesis of all the different factors, like design. That's, kind of design is like break it apart and get it into one thing. And so the power and the control here is very different. And this is why it only works well with a project that is known, like a Walmart or a Costco or a Tim Hortons or a warehouse. So back in 2000, and I'm going to say the airport did a project that was design build, which is the arrivals area. And it ended up in a lawsuit. And one of the key factors of the lawsuit is that the owner felt they should have 4 elevators. And the builder said, oh, hell no, our calculations say you only need 1 elevator. And so from the day that place opened, it never had enough elevators, and it became a legal dispute. And now it has more elevators, by the way, because in a subsequent project, they got smart and added the elevators, but it was a lawsuit. And this has to do with the fact, like, an airport is the farthest thing from a typical building. There's nothing typical about a building. So it was totally the wrong methodology. So the owner gets a turnkey building. The owner sets parameters of the desired building. I want a 10,000 square foot warehouse by September 1st and make it blue, and waits for it to be built. The cons, usually there's a disconnect between the owner's expectations. I meant indigo blue, not baby blue, and the construction team. What are you talking about? Blue is blue, and that's what we agreed to provide. Go pound sand. Not usually for specific complex building types, and it's hard for the design team to have any power of quality of the contractor's worth. And I'll just add to that, having been an architect on a design build project where the builder is in charge of me, I dance to the song that the builder wants me to dance to, not the owner. So if the builder says, well, we can get away with a 3-foot deep foundation instead of a 4-foot deep foundation, there's a loophole in the building code. I'm like, oh my gosh, I want standard 4-foot deep foundation. And it's very hard for me to maintain my professional limits against the pressure of someone who frankly is paying my bills, right? So it's an important dynamic that you really want to, only really experienced clients really want to get into. Construction management, the architect designs, this is a new model and it's supported. There's a couple different ways to do construction management. The architect designs under the traditional design build model, but the drawings are broken into trade packages. So we do a set of drawings for the drywaller, a set of drawings for the electrician, a set of drawings for the mechanical people, a set of drawings for the foundations. The owner engages a construction manager who's usually typically a general contractor to manage all the subcontractors. The owner holds all of the contracts with each of the subcontractors, and it's used when the owner wants an open book to see all the different agreements, and it allows for fast tracking or sequential tendering. What it really means is, because I'm only doing the drawings for the foundations, and then I'm only doing the drawings for the drywall, and I'm only doing the drawings for the electrician, I can actually get those foundation drawings done a little bit sooner, and I can get that excavation and foundation work done sooner. So if I'm taking out a massive, $40 million loan from the bank is going to charge me interest on that loan right away, but I don't have an asset against that loan. So I want to start as soon as possible so I can start drawing on that loan. And so this is why developers love this methodology, because they can get, let's say, in the ground, they can get their project started sooner and start drawing on that high interest loan. Again, you don't need to remember the specifics of this, but these methodologies are geared around, financial structures, risk transfer, and those kinds of things. So just to look at what that diagram looks like. same engagement between the architect and the owner as design bid build. But here's a very interesting thing. So they'll contract with the construction manager, and then the construction manager will manage all those sub-trade roles, but the owner will have a contract with each of those sub-trades. So we're doing an expansion to the IWK right now, but well, I probably shouldn't say, but it's many millions of dollars under construction management. And the contracts between, let's say, government and the trades are between each of the sub-trades. So I just want to invite anyone to comment on what they might see just from a contracting methodology where some risks might be on this. Anyone can guess.
So the construction manager is managing contracts that he hasn't negotiated, and he has no power also over the architects again. So
yep,
he's out there in right field.
Yeah, and the owner often feels that the construction manager should be taking on risk, and they're not. They're managing.
Yeah.
So what might happen if the let's say the drywaller gets delayed? Their whole staff gets COVID, and their other project is over schedule, and they're delayed by 3 weeks. How would that affect, let's say, the electrician?
Could be like dominoes, like
Yeah.
just then the owner can't complete their end of the contract with the electrician, and that electrician moves on to a different project, and then
Right.
you don't have a house.
Right.
But the electrician's going in before the drywall, right?
The electrician's going to go in before and
right.
after.
Oh, and after. Okay.
Yep. Even more complicated. And the painter, right? The painter can't paint if there's no drywall. And the drywaller says, well, I can't do the drywall until you finish the electrical rough-ins. And the electrical saying, well, I can't hook up my electrical because the mechanical people haven't finished installing the HVAC equipment. Mechanical people say, well, until there's a roof on, I'm not putting my mechanical equipment in. And everyone's going, where the hell's the roofer? They're in Newfoundland on a job. They got COVID. So what does that look like for the owner?
A mess.
Having been at the table, I can tell you what this looks like. There's about 35 trades. If you do a 35 trade package construction management project, and when one of these trades screws up, there are 35 lawyers at the table. And that is a massively expensive table to resolve a dispute because, you know, someone got one entity got delayed for a week or two. So owners rarely recognize the amount of legal exposure they have. They think this is great because they're going to start the project a couple months sooner and they can draw on that loan and they can get the financials moving along. And they're willing to take on this massive risk that they really haven't identified until they've gone through hell with a dispute like that. So even if even if the flooring doesn't go down right, it's bubbling because there's some moisture issue. Who's responsible for that? Is it the designer? Is it the excavator who didn't excavate the water out? Is it the damp proofer? Is it the concrete? The concrete didn't cure. Is it the flooring people because they didn't use the right glue for the flooring, or did they not wait until the concrete was cured enough before they put the flooring down? Or did they say, well, we can't put the curing down, the concrete, we can't put the flooring down because the concrete's not cured yet. And the owner said, to hell with you, we got to get going. We got to get this done. I got to draw down on my loan. So there's a lot of pressure on a project. And you want to look really at what is my contractual exposure here? Am I sitting down with 35 lawyers? Am I sitting down with one to resolve a problem? And by the way, when I say a problem, I'm really talking about 10 years of resolving an issue through a legal system, and that's not going to court. It'd be 20 years probably going to court. So just to give you a little perspective on these, if I had takeaways as I'm talking about this, I'm just talking about, underlying the systems of project delivery. The game isn't for the owner. That none of this is set up to advantage an owner. It's set up to advantage the industry, and you want to just keep that in mind. because builders build. Every single project is, just part of what they do. It's their total portfolio. For you, your project is special. It's the one time you're doing it. You're not really an expert at it, and so the game is set up for them. So just sorry, I got a little bit off track there. Construction management pros: accelerated construction. Trade packages can be released sequential. Excavation and then foundations is the first package, followed by structure, followed by M&E, and so on. The construction manager starts around midway through the design phase, lending construction expertise and usually taking some degree of responsibility for estimating cost. The downsides: the owner has legal exposure of holding contracts for each trade. There's ambiguity as to who holds risk with respect to budget and schedule, and there's trade scoping craziness. So the other thing about having all those packages is, like, if you have the people that build the studs in the walls, and then you have the people that put the siding on, but you forget which of those two gets the installation, then you might realize, oh my gosh, we haven't done a tender for the installation. And this happens all the time, because what the design team does is they draw the result. They draw what we want it to be in the end, and the construction manager does the scoping, which trade package is going to bid on it, and there can be gaps all the time. It's just infuriating to deal with. And I'm not actually calling this a bad methodology. This is a well-practiced methodology. You just have to really know what you're doing. So that's some highlights of some of those different aspects. These are some schedule. This is just kind of a design bid build schedule compared to a construction management schedule. So the blue is the construction activity, the orange is the design team activity. And so you can see in month 5, or whatever it is, week 5, year 5, whatever, item 5, we've started construction, right? And you can see the construction activities lined out. But if I can get my excavation and formwork and concrete package designed and put out on to tender sooner, my schedule might look a little like this, where I'm starting my construction activity before I'm done designing my whole building, and I can get that advanced up. So this is, owners are incredibly seduced by this, because, oh, we can get started sooner, we can end sooner. And I've never seen a project under construction management actually end sooner, but that start sooner is very, very seductive because of that whole cash flow thing and grants and whatever the money is driving it. So there's my kind of overview of stuff. Just to give you an idea about project delivery, every project really needs to have an appropriate setup that is tailored to the project and the client's capabilities, the owner's capabilities. And I'll just say, going forward, there are a couple areas where in my business right now, with my kind of leading clients, we are taking this a little further. And one is decolonizing this process, adding a diversity, equity, inclusion lens, how you involve stakeholders more powerfully in this, because the forces of money and risk override stakeholders quite quickly. And that is part of that decolonizing DEI lens. It's a very fascinating, very exciting aspect. And one of the reasons is because the thing I avoid the most is getting myself into that adversarial thing. Remember that contract, that point that there's this conflict between the entities. I hate that. I hate the conflict. And so looking at it through some of these lenses that we're all thinking about right now in many of our organizations, how would we be more inclusive? How do we facilitate a more constructive conversation? How do we decolonize our decision making? How we might use storytelling to solve a problem rather than confrontation? How we use confrontation more effectively and more positively? These are all futuristic ways, I think, of looking at how we resolve conflict in a high risk, high stakes environment that a project is. The last thing I'll say is, although some of this is like murky and complex and there's more like negative stories to tell, I will say that projects are massive positive catalysts for organizations, and you shouldn't be intimidated by this stuff. What you want to know is that there's industry standard, there's process that you can rely on, you can depend on, that there's usually a typical answer for a thing that you don't quite understand, and you can gravitate towards that. And so long as you don't diverge too much from that, you can kind of rely on it. So you shouldn't be intimidated by it. You should really take away from this that there's lots out there to support any project. And so I will just leave it at that, and I hope I hit the highlights.